Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Breaking news coming from Washington and Ankara as the United States has announced new punitive actions against Turkey over its deepening ties with Iran. This shocking move has sent ripples across the Middle East and NATO allies, raising fears of a new diplomatic storm between longtime partners. The sanctions come at a moment when the Israel Hamas war continues to rage, pushing the region into further instability. The United States Department of Treasury confirmed that several Turkish financial institutions and companies have been sanctioned for helping Iran bypass international restrictions. Washington officials claim these entities have been facilitating oil sales, weapons deals, and money transfers connected to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which the U.S. labels as a terrorist organization. The move is part of Washington's broader strategy to pressure Tehran and cut off its sources of funding used to support militant groups across the Middle East. Ankara reacted immediately, calling the U.S. decision unjustified and politically motivated. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan declared that Turkey is an independent nation and will not allow any foreign power to dictate its trade policies. He emphasized that the cooperation between Ankara and Tehran focuses on energy trade and regional stability, not military collaboration. Erdogan stated that Turkey will continue to defend its sovereignty against all external interference. The U.S. sanctions come at a time when tensions in the region are already at a boiling point, as Israel continues its military operations in Gaza against Hamas. The Biden administration has accused Iran of supplying Hamas and Hezbollah with advanced weaponry and intelligence support, while also funding their networks in Lebanon and Syria. Now Washington believes that Turkey's close ties with Tehran could undermine efforts to isolate Iran and weaken its proxy influence. Analysts say the sanctions reflect Washington's growing frustration with Ankara, as relations between the two NATO members have become increasingly complicated in recent years. Disputes over the purchase of Russian S-400 missile systems, human rights issues, and diverging foreign policy agendas have strained the alliance even further. This latest development could mark a new low in bilateral relations inside Turkey. The reaction has been fierce. National media outlets are calling the sanctions an attack on the Turkish economy and sovereignty. Citizens in major cities like Istanbul and Ankara have held rallies denouncing the United States, accusing Washington of hypocrisy and double standards. Banners reading, "Turkey will not bow down," have appeared across social media platforms, fueling anti-American sentiment that has been growing for years. Economically, the impact could be significant. Turkish exports to Western markets might face restrictions, and foreign investors are already showing signs of hesitation. The lira has dropped slightly since the announcement, reflecting market anxiety over future trade disruptions. Energy analysts warn that the sanctions could complicate Turkey's oil imports from Iran, which have long been a vital part of the country's energy security. Meanwhile, the timing of these sanctions raises questions about Washington's long-term strategy in the Middle East as the Israel-Hamas conflict intensifies. The U.S. is attempting to maintain support for Israel while preventing the war from spiraling into a regional confrontation, yet its actions against Turkey risk alienating one of the few Muslim-majority nations that still plays a diplomatic balancing role between East and West. Tehran officials welcomed the move as evidence that the U.S. is losing control of its alliances. Iranian media praised Turkey for standing against Western pressure and suggested that Ankara and Tehran should deepen cooperation in trade, energy, and defense sectors. Iran Foreign Ministry spokesman said that Washington's sanctions policy has failed for decades and that the U.S. is only isolating itself from regional powers. The situation has also alarmed European leaders, some of whom worry that targeting Turkey could destabilize NATO unity. Several European Union officials have urged Washington to seek dialogue instead of confrontation, arguing that pushing Turkey closer to Iran and Russia could have long-term consequences for Western influence in the region. This sentiment echoes among diplomats who see Ankara as too important to be cornered. At the same time, the Israeli government has quietly welcomed the U.S. decision, viewing it as a sign that Washington is serious about curbing Iranian influence in the region. Israeli officials have long accused Turkey of supporting Hamas both politically and financially, something Ankara has repeatedly denied. However, Turkish leaders continue to host Hamas representatives in diplomatic forums, calling for peace talks and humanitarian aid to Gaza. Behind-the-scenes intelligence sources suggest that the sanctions also target Turkish front companies that allegedly helped Iran acquire dual-use technologies, which could support its missile and drone programs, according to reports. From Washington, the Biden administration coordinated the sanctions with allies in Europe to tighten enforcement across global financial networks. For Turkey, this latest confrontation with the U.S. adds to a growing list of disputes that have tested the endurance of their partnership, once seen as a cornerstone of NATO unity. Now Ankara finds itself navigating between competing powers. Turkey maintains economic ties with Russia, military cooperation with Azerbaijan, and strategic energy projects. With Iran, this multipolar strategy has drawn criticism from the West, but Erdogan insists it represents Turkey's national interest in a changing world. Public opinion inside Turkey has shifted dramatically over the years. Once a strong supporter of Western alignment, many citizens now view American actions as hostile interference. Political analysts say Erdogan government has successfully used this narrative to rally domestic support, portraying the U.S. as an unreliable partner trying to undermine Turkish independence. In Washington, officials defend the sanctions as necessary to maintain pressure on Iran and prevent money from flowing to terrorist organizations. They argue that Turkey had been warned multiple times about these activities, but failed to take corrective action. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken stated that no ally is exempt from responsibility in the fight against terrorism, and that Turkey's behavior could not be ignored any longer. Regional experts believe this. Confrontation could mark a turning point in Middle Eastern politics if Turkey doubles down on its partnership with Iran and continues to resist U.S. pressure. It could pave the way for a new bloc of countries challenging Western dominance. This scenario worries many Western policymakers who fear a deeper alignment between Ankara, Moscow, and Tehran, forming a triangle of anti-Western cooperation. The implications go beyond politics. The sanctions may disrupt critical supply chains affecting energy, transportation, and banking sectors throughout the region. Turkish banks have already begun reviewing transactions to avoid secondary penalties from the U.S., while Iranian traders see an opportunity to strengthen underground trade networks that bypass the dollar system. Meanwhile, the war in Gaza continues to overshadow all other developments. Civilian casualties rise every day as Israeli airstrikes hit Hamas targets and ground operations expand. Humanitarian organizations warn of an impending catastrophe. Turkey has been one of the most vocal critics of Israel's actions, calling them disproportionate and inhumane. This stance has further angered both Israel and its allies, who see Ankara as siding with Iran and Hamas rather than promoting peace. Despite growing isolation, Turkey remains defiant. Erdogan has vowed to continue supporting the Palestinian cause and expanding regional influence through diplomacy, trade, and cultural ties. He believes that the Muslim world must unite against Western double standards. This message resonates strongly among Turkish citizens and across parts of the Arab world, who see Ankara as standing up to Washington's pressure. Diplomatic back channels are now working overtime to prevent the situation. From spiraling out-of-control reports suggest that Qatar and Oman are quietly mediating between Ankara and Washington, trying to create room for dialogue. However, both sides remain entrenched. The U.S. insists that Turkey must sever ties with sanctioned Iranian entities, while Turkey demands respect for its sovereignty and independent decision-making. As this standoff deepens, the broader question emerges: what does this mean for NATO unity? If two key members continue clashing publicly, experts fear It could undermine the alliance's credibility and cohesion, especially as the war in Ukraine and tensions in the South China Sea demand a united Western front against global instability. In the streets of Ankara, ordinary citizens express frustration and fatigue over continuous geopolitical battles that affect the economy. Prices are rising. Inflation is biting hard, and now new sanctions threaten further hardship, yet public support for the government remains strong, with many viewing Erdogan as defending national pride against Western dominance. Across the Middle East, reactions are mixed. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have remained cautious, balancing their own relations with both the U.S. and Turkey. Meanwhile, Russia and Iran have openly expressed solidarity with Ankara and condemned Washington's actions. Russian officials described the sanctions as an act of economic warfare and vowed to increase cooperation with Turkey.